If you tried to follow every recommendation in the new dietary guidelines, you'd likely break one without even realizing it. Let me show you where the math just doesn't line up. The 2025 to 2030 Dietary Guidelines for Americans just dropped, and I read everything. The guide, the scientific foundation, all of it. What I found is a mix, genuinely good advice, notable gaps, and some flat-out contradictions. Now, before we dive in, let me be perfectly clear, this is not a political video. Every set of guidelines is political because they come from the government. But my job as a registered dietitian is to evaluate the science, highlight the inconsistencies, and give you practical information you can use. Hey there, I'm Amy Lawson, registered dietitian, and here on my channel, Thrive Nutrition RDN, you will find evidence-based nutrition insight, myth-busting that actually helps, and practical tips that you can use today. Plus, I share recipes that make healthy eating easy and enjoyable. We've got a lot to unpack today. These guidelines influence everything from school lunch programs to clinical nutrition advice. Whether you're a parent, a health professional, or someone trying to eat well, you deserve to understand what is in them. And just to be clear, this isn't some sort of bashing video. There are plenty of channels that are built on outrage and anger, and that is not what this is. My role here is to evaluate the research behind these guidelines as a registered dietitian with a master's degree in nutrition and explain where the evidence is strong, where it's weak, and where the recommendations don't fully line up. And one more thing, this video is not sponsored at all. I actually read the full reports, which I have here. No sponsors, just the science. Let's start at the very beginning, the conflicts of interest. This has to be shared. And this isn't unique to 2025 guidelines. It's been a theme for years in our dietary guidelines, but it definitely matters. When you look at who sits on the advisory committee and who funds nutrition research, a pattern definitely emerges. Organizations like the National Cattlemen's Beef Association, Global Dairy Platform, National Pork Board, and General Mills, major food companies have long-standing ties to committee members, and these ties can influence what is studied and what gets recommended. This is documented, ongoing influence. Now let's get into it. Okay, we have to talk about the inverted pyramid graphic. First of all, it looks super retro, and I know lots of people online are questioning why it looks like generic clip art or why it looks like it was created 20 years ago. I think that was the point, for it to have this retro look and feel, but it was definitely kind of a missed opportunity to create something cool, like have an artist create something cool. But I digress. I do love to see big old clip art of broccoli at the top of that inverted pyramid. Now, one thing that really struck me in the promotional materials was the comparison to the food pyramid, the old, way outdated food pyramid. And I have to ask, why are we still doing this? The food pyramid was retired in 2011, and all dietitians stopped using it years ago. We moved to MyPlate because the pyramid was confusing for real-world eating and just majorly outdated all the advice. They're trying to make a stark contrast between the old pyramid and the new pyramid, but what they're missing is that we've been using MyPlate for many years now, and it is a visual representation of what our plate should look like and shows balance, and it's been a really helpful tool. So that kind of marketing exaggeration creates myths around nutrition tools that nutrition professionals haven't even used in years. And hey, here's your reminder to hit that subscribe button. Join my channel for evidence-based nutrition content that cuts through the noise. So hit subscribe. I truly appreciate each and every one of you. And speaking of hyperbole, we need to talk about the war on saturated fat.
We are ending the war on saturated fats.
And war on protein language, because this really grinds my gears and frankly, it just makes me mad. As a military spouse married to someone who has actually been to war, along with plenty of friends who've been to war, this language bothers me so much. But beyond my personal feelings, let me be clear, there is no war on protein. There is no war on saturated fat. Like, give me a break. The language is designed to create outrage and division, and it's clickbait that's applied to nutrition policy, and it's completely exhausting. Nutrition is complex enough without turning every guideline into a battle that does not exist. All right, now let's talk about something that I'm actually really happy about in the guidelines, the new protein recommendations. This is one area where the guidelines genuinely got it right. The recommendation of 1.2 to 1.6 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight per day is good. This is a much needed improvement from the previous recommendations of 0.8 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight per day, which was just too low for most people. In fact, I did a whole video on protein. I'm going to link it below. It was too low for most people, especially those who are active, trying to maintain muscle mass, looking for longevity, all of those things. This updated range is much more in line with current research and what we know about optimal protein intake for health, muscle maintenance, and for satiety. Now, of course, protein quality and distribution throughout the day are important, and needs can vary based on our activity levels, our health, and our goals. One little problem though, why highlight red meat specifically? The evidence suggests moderation of red meat is better for health outcomes. And there are plenty of excellent alternatives, but overall protein gets the attention it deserves here. Now for the big one, saturated fat. This is where the dietary guidelines become internally inconsistent. The guidelines recommend less than 10% of our total calories from saturated fat. Now on a 2,000 calorie a day diet, that's 22 grams of saturated fat or less per day. At the same time, they also recommend 3 servings of dairy and more animal-based protein daily. On paper, those 2 recommendations sound pretty reasonable, but in practice, they do not add up. Let me show you why. Let's do the math. 3 servings of that dairy daily, a cup of whole milk, 5 grams of saturated fat, a cup of yogurt, 5 grams of saturated fat, an ounce and a half of cheddar cheese, 6 grams. Then we start adding in our animal protein. 3 ounces of 80-20 ground beef is 7 grams. That's 23 grams of saturated fat right there, already past the limit, before we've added other things like cooking oils, butter, which is going to come up more later, other foods, eggs, even more protein before any of that enters the picture. So the guideline messages here are mathematically incompatible. Now here's where it gets even more muddled. That doesn't mean that saturated fat is good or irrelevant. The evidence shows what matters most is what saturated fat is replaced with. When replaced with unsaturated fats like nuts, fish, and vegetable oils, heart disease drops about 30% in some studies, but when it's replaced with refined carbs or added sugars, no benefit. This helps explain why studies looking at saturated fat alone show mixed results, and some large trials, like the research that's shown in the DGAs, found no clear link between saturated fat intake and heart disease or mortality. But the guidelines just don't reflect this nuance well. And the scientific report itself says more research is needed to determine optimal fat types. Yet they clearly are putting an emphasis on saturated fats in the guides. And also, why call out beef tallow specifically? Of all the fats, why single out that one? It feels selective, not evidence-based. The one thing they do get right here, acknowledging that low-fat foods often had added sugars and additives to make them palatable, which was a real net negative for our health. So I'm glad they called that out. Now for this video, I am just hitting the highlights of the fat section, but there is so much more in the DGAs and the scientific guide. If you want a full deep dive into the saturated fat studies referenced in the guidelines, let me know down in the comments. There's a lot there, and it really deserves its own focus breakdown. Let me know in the comments. Here's what really aligns with good evidence, because there are some genuinely good recommendations here. Number 1, that protein, the updated protein recommendations of 1.2 to 1.6 grams per kilogram of body weight per day are significant improvement. And olive oil, I'm so happy that olive oil got a mention and multiple mentions in the fat section. This is a healthy fat that's well researched and associated with numerous health benefits, especially for heart health. Also, carbohydrates. Now, looking at the inverted pyramid, it is definitely sort of visually inferred that carbohydrates are low on the list. But the scientific foundation for the dietary guidelines says that randomized controlled trials demonstrate beneficial heart health effects of minimally processed carbohydrate foods such as fruits, vegetables, and whole grains. And they acknowledge that increasing intake of veggies and fruit improves blood pressure, heart health, and inflammation. And higher whole grain intake is associated with lower all-cause mortality. This is exactly the kind of evidence-based nutrition guidelines we need. And fiber, the mention of fiber and the recommendation of 25 to 30 grams per day is beneficial and well supported by research. I talk about fiber all the time on my channel here. And this is an area where most Americans fall short, so highlighting it is super important. Gut microbiome. I am glad to see the mention of gut microbiome in these guidelines. The connection between gut health and overall health is becoming clearer in the research, And it's so good to see this reflected in national nutrition guidance. I also love their stance on added sugars. The emphasis of limiting or avoiding added sugars is spot on. Added sugars are definitely a major contributor to chronic disease, and I'm so happy to see strong language around reducing these. And this is honestly one of the clearest, most evidence-based recommendations in the entire document. Now, ultra-processed foods. We need to talk about this because this was a major part of this guide. The reduction of ultra-processed foods is definitely a win, this recommendation. And I'm genuinely hopeful about their plan to explicitly identify what qualifies as ultra-processed, because this has been a huge source of confusion. And looking through the guide, you will see multiple instances where reduction of ultra-processed foods are recommended. Now, here's my cautious optimism. Right now, some foods that are technically considered processed, like frozen vegetables without added sauces or canned beans without added sugar, can get lumped into the same category as heavily processed junk food. They are not the same thing nutritionally. Frozen and canned fruits and veggies, when they're just the produce without a bunch of added ingredients, are excellent for our health. They're affordable, they reduce food waste, and they're often more accessible than fresh. So I'm hopeful that whatever classification system they develop will distinguish between minimally processed for preservation and ultra-processed with additives, added sugars, and refined ingredients. And they did touch on this a little bit in the guide, so I'm very hopeful for the new recommendations. If they get this definition right, it could be really helpful for consumers trying to make sense of food labels, which we know can be so confusing. Another positive, the whole foods emphasis. This is consistent with pretty much every major nutrition organization's recommendations, and it's backed by solid evidence. Here's where the guidelines fall short. They're not truly reflecting how people actually eat. Case in point, the contradiction of saturated fat and dairy and animal protein recommendations. Now let's talk about dairy. They recommend 3 servings daily a day. And this just doesn't fit everyone. People who have lactose intolerance, allergies, cultural patterns, or personal choice. Yet alternatives like soy, a complete protein often fortified with calcium and vitamin D, are barely mentioned. And then access and affordability. Nutrition guidance only works if people can act on it. The guidelines spend minimal time on food access, cost, or working family realities, yet these factors shape our choices every single day. And also culture. The US is diverse. Mediterranean, Asian, Latino, there are so many more eating patterns that are associated with good health outcomes. These should be examples, not afterthoughts. And I'll be very clear, I'm all about action steps. If these guidelines are going to shape school nutrition lunches, federal programs, and public health policy, we need real-world implementation, not just theoretical guidelines where the math doesn't add up. So here's my bottom line as a registered dietitian. The guidelines do get some things right. Protein, yay! Sugars, ultra-processed foods, but they also contain contradictions, notable gaps, and evidence that isn't fully reflected. Now, they do say they are all about using the gold standard randomized controlled trials, which is awesome. I just want to make sure that we are looking at all the evidence. What you should take away is this: focus on what consistently works. Mostly whole foods, plenty of vegetables, fruits, enough protein for sure, limited added sugars, and adapt based on your own goals, your preferences, your budget, and health. And if you want help applying any of these principles in a way that actually fits your life, that's what I do in my nutrition programs and my meal planning programs. I am dropping all the links down below. Now, this video was just the highlights. There is a lot more we can unpack. So drop me a comment. What surprised you the most about the guidelines? What do you want me to dive into deeper next? I read every comment, and your questions help guide future videos. And now we've talked a lot about protein. So next up, I want to break down for you plant versus animal protein and what the research actually says. So click the video on your screen right now, and I will see you over there. Until then, eat well, be well, thrive.